wanted to take you through my thinking sort of stream of consciousness, if you will, threaded by some data points. We can go to the next slide. And first off, I want to thank our media partners. Suffolk University really has been blessed with the confidence of so many great media partners through the years. And in 2024, we're happy to have the partnerships that you see on the screen. One of the newest partners is the Los Angeles Times, the LA Times, which isn't really in a swing state, but we've done some polling for them, some City View polling for them as well, and they've been terrific. And as you can see, the list topped by USA Today for national polling and a host of other properties that we'll be partnering with in some of the crucial states. Next slide. So what is the typical road traveled by politics, politicians, political scientists? Everyone seems to be obsessed with likely voters, right? We are obsessed with likely voters as pollsters. If we call you on the phone and you're not a registered voter or likely voter in the election, we terminate the call. We only want to be discussing issues and getting your feelings if you are what we would call a likely voter. But there's a mass of people who are not likely voters. Next slide. And those voters, potential voters, are unlikely voters. And as you'll see in the next slide, the unlikely voters are made up of both those that are unregistered and those that are registered to vote, but not likely. Can we advance the slide there? We go to the next slide. Possibly. Here we go. And so there are two roads to be thinking about. One is the conventional road of likely voters, and the other is unlikely voters. So you may say, well, who cares? Who cares about the unlikely voters? They're not registered. They don't matter. Or they're registered, but they somehow are too busy to vote. Who cares about them? Well, it turns out that in the last election in 2020, both Donald Trump and Joe Biden broke the record for most votes cast, which means that a lot of unlikely voters voted. That's the good news in 2020. Next slide. But I want to show you how many people, even in this record turnout of 2020, how many people who were eligible to vote didn't vote. Now, these aren't people who are too young. These aren't people who aren't citizens. These are people who are voter eligible, and they still decided not to vote. So in 2020, Joe Biden received 81 million votes. You see what Trump received. Both Joe Biden and Donald Trump beat the previous record, both of them, which was Barack Obama in 2008. Hope and Change, and Barack Obama as a candidate brought many, many more Black voters and young voters to the table, and he set the record with 69.5 million voters. Joe Biden eclipses that, and Donald Trump eclipsed that in 2020. But look at the bottom bullet. 82 million voters did not vote. That's a bigger number than even what Joe Biden received. So we believe that the unlikely voter, the person that's either not registered or that's registered and doesn't vote, really is an untapped resource and accounts for a significant chunk of the US population. Next slide. And so we conducted a poll. We've done 3 of these in September of 2023. Next slide. The methodology was we did the calls in August. We called all 50 states. We interviewed 900 adults who were voter eligible. and we published the results last year. Next slide. So what's the kind of thing that we found? We asked this question on all three of the unlikely, the non-voters. Do the two major parties, Democrat and Republican, do a good job of representing Americans' political views, or do you think a third party or multiple parties is necessary? This has been a standing finding that we've seen in 3 polls. People who are unlikely to vote, non-voters, do not like the two-party system. Either they come from a country that has multiple parties, they feel more comfortable with a more diverse selection, a menu of choices, but only 17% of them believe that 2 parties are good enough. Another 20% say a third party is necessary, and 44% say multiple parties necessary. Next slide. Well, what do we know about these non-voters? We know that they hate everybody. They don't like Biden. You see the favorable, unfavorable in red. They don't like Trump. They don't like Congress. They really don't like news media, and so on. So they're disconnected. They have a bad taste in their mouth. They don't like the two-party system. Next slide. What else do we know about the non-voters? We asked the question, if you knew that your vote could swing a close national election, would you then register or would you then vote? Now, these were people who we previously had asked, who do you think you'd vote for if you were registered? Or who do you think you'd vote for if you were to go out and vote? 68% of potential Biden voters said that they would step up to the plate and get involved in the process if they thought their vote mattered.
Wow.
20% said no. 70% of Trump voters said the same thing. So within the margin of error, an overwhelming majority of people who are non-voters would engage if they thought their vote could swing a close national election. Next slide. We asked an open-ended question. What would it take to get you to vote in November 2024 among the non-voters? And I hearken back to Barack Obama in 2008, who was a different candidate, a candidate that exuded positivity. And the number one answer among non-voters, I want a better choice. Obviously, 2024 is not going to help us engage these people because we have the same 2 choices that we've had over the last 4 years. I want a better choice. I want an honest candidate, someone that I like, 28%. The election process, 5% is problematic. I need more information on the candidates, their views, stands on the issues. If I could vote, some of the respondents were felons, and felons are not able to vote in certain instances in states, in federal elections. Next slide. We asked these non-voters, do you follow what's going on in government and public affairs? Now, when you look at this, you'd say, well, not even half are engaged. I thought this number would be even lower because they don't vote. They're not, they're not connected. They don't like the parties. But 46% said that they do follow what's going on in government and public affairs. And then another 53% said hardly at all or now and then. And then we asked an open-ended question, can you name the Vice President of the United States? Now, in some previous polls, the number was 50% when we asked about Mike Pence, and they couldn't name Mike Pence. When we asked who was Trump's vice president, here there were more identifiers, which we included. Kamala Harris, some people mispronounced her name or had half of it right, or they would identify her in other ways. But 70% indicated that. Next slide. Let's take a look at actual voters. This is voter turnout by race or ethnicity in 2020 based on the exit polls in the 2020 presidential election. So as you can see, whites, 71% of whites turned out, 63% of blacks, 60% of Asians, and then you have Latinos 4th. This informs us that for whatever reason, Latinos are not turning out percentage-wise by the same numbers. Next slide. We also know, based on the 2020 exit polls, who they voted for. According to the exit polls left chart, Biden defeated Trump 65-32, according to the exit polls, but in the actual data, in the poll that we released a couple of weeks ago, Biden's lead was only 6%, with RFK getting 14%, and a sizable number saying undecided or other. So this sort of fills in another piece. We know that the voter turnout is low and that there's a high undecided or even a yearning for third party. Next slide. And we also know that Hispanic voters are the most fluid. The question to people who did have a candidate in mind in the poll, the national poll of 2 weeks ago, the overall number was 75% of those voters who had made a choice have made up their mind. 79% of whites, 73% of blacks, but only 61% of Hispanics were, and more Hispanics in this poll said that they could change their mind. So we have low voter turnout. We have a high undecided among those people. And even among people who have decided who they like, we are showing that they could change their mind. More fluidity. Next slide. And who then could influence the election? We saw Robert De Niro yesterday outside of the Trump trial, using his celebrity to try and implore voters to support President Biden. Some viewed that as a missed opportunity. Some people viewed it as a failed attempt. But if you look at actual data, the couple of Michelle and Barack Obama really have an impact. What we did in this poll is that we listed 20 former politicians plus celebrities, and we asked which of these people would influence your vote a lot or a little. And as you can see here, Barack Obama, among all voters, has an influence of 35%, but among Hispanic voters, 51% combined a lot and a little. 29% for Michelle Obama among all voters, but among Hispanic voters, 40%. So this is probably counterintuitive, where Barack Obama might be deployed or Michelle Obama be focused with just African Americans. But what this poll is telling us, that the Obamas as a power couple resonates really strong. And we had a big list. We had Bill Clinton on the list. George Bush was on the list, Oprah Winfrey, Taylor Swift, Kim Kardashian. We had Tiger Woods. We had a number of celebrities on this list, and none of them were as popular and influential to the electorate as Michelle and Barack Obama. Next slide. So why hasn't the demographic of, quote, Hispanics or Hispanic Latinos, why hasn't that demographic, that fastest growing demographic in the country, ever had a slot on a major party ticket, president or vice president on the Democratic side, president or vice president on the Republican side? It's amazing to me, with the growth and the trajectory of population, and I would say this in the classroom for any group, but I'm focused on the Hispanic population for the presentation tonight, because it's mind-boggling to me. Next slide. With the amount of people that we're talking about. Consider the population statistics in the United States. 20% of the country is Hispanic. And I'm Greek. The Greek population is 0.6%. And we in the Greek community, we've had on the Democratic and on the Republican side, someone who represents our community. We had Michael Dukakis in 1988. Many of you remember him, former governor of Massachusetts. And we've had Spiro Agnew, who was the vice president in the late 60s and early 70s on the Republican ticket. he served for 4 years. Mike Dukakis did not win. He lost to George Bush, but he was the nominee. And so it's frustrating to me as a Greek American with so few fellow Greeks in not only Massachusetts, but in the country, to be looking at the Hispanic Latino community, which has just built a high wall of population strength in this country, and to think about why we don't have and haven't had an Hispanic for a president or vice president on either side. It doesn't matter which political party, but representing this important community. Next slide. And so what's the answer to this? And I believe we would like to set a goal, just like Barack Obama did in 2008. He was convinced he was going to win that election. He was going to beat Hillary Clinton, even though it was 45 points behind, and she was expected to win that 2008 Democratic nomination. We are, and the people in the Hispanic community need to set an aggressive target. We would like a Democratic and a Republican, either Democratic president or vice president nominee on either side. Next slide. Well, how do we get there? And how do we get the old-fashioned, traditional Democratic Party and Republican Party to even acknowledge or recognize the benefits of Hispanics on a presidential ticket? Again, either way, Democrat or Republican. And the answer is to bring more actual voters to the table so that it can't be ignored, and to convert those unlikely voters to likely voters. How do you do that? Well, for the people not registered, you register them more Hispanics nationally. For those people who are registered but just don't vote, you have to increase turnout among those who are currently Hispanic registered voters. Next slide. How do we do this? Fortaleza. To build the strength upon the strength that you have. This is a word, a Spanish word, as you know, as many of you know, that means to fortify, to strengthen. And I hate to see the population mushroom to 20% and then have the walls cave in for whatever reason, and the community not having someone on the presidential ticket. And so how do we do this? How do we get an Hispanic on the Democratic and the Republican ticket in 4 years? Person-to-person recruitment at the local level, kind of going back to Mike Dukakis's, precinct captain in every place. Fundraising, stakeholders getting celebrity and other figures to become part of this who are Hispanic descent. Mass advertising and local elections to linchpin that kind of support. Next slide. Let's take them one at a time. Person-to-person recruitment. If you said to me tonight, if someone in this audience said to me tonight, provide me with a list of people in my hometown who are Hispanic but who are not registered to vote, I could do that. Provide me with a list of people in my hometown who are Hispanic and registered to vote, but who never vote in elections. I could do that. It might take some cost. It might take some time to put that list together, but that's the kind of list building I would like to see happen. Person-to-person recruitment, neighbor to neighbor, and set reasonable goals. For people who are interested in this, I would say to them, you've got 4 years between now and 2028. 4 years. Can you find 5 people in your community who are not registered and 5 people who are registered who never vote? And find out where they live, reach out to them, call them, see if you see them at a festival or a community event, make that your goal. Recruit 5 people and get 5 people to commit to voting. Democrat or Republican, doesn't matter. Person-to-person recruitment. Next slide. Fundraising. Fundraising is always important. Everybody talks about it. I think there ought to be a local tier where people can contribute a really low dollar amount, something that everybody could contribute, and then you could come back to them the following year, or get them to do repeat donations. Let people have skin in the game. Obviously, there were people who could do more than, a nominal amount. A one-time donation between 1 and 1,000 or 1,000 a year, or a corporate sponsorship who would be willing to donate to a cause, whoever puts this program together, to do the kind of things it need to do. Next slide. Stakeholders. The Hispanic community has amazing athletes, music performers, entertainers, television stars, influencers on TikTok, influencers on Instagram and other social media. Let's get them to buy into this. Can we do this by 2028? Are they interested in honoring their country of heritage to become part of this bigger idea? Next slide. Mass advertising. Social media, you have to advertise. Radio. There are a lot of Spanish dailies and weeklies across the country, many of whom could use an influx of capital and advertising, and they would be thrilled to help buy into this. In addition to SMS target texting and emails, the kind of mass advertising you'd see on a corporate campaign. Next slide. Run candidates in local elections. Why is this important? And I've seen this locally here. I do a lot of local races in addition to the work at Suffolk. It does a lot of things because we get the candidates to register voters. So right there, you're driving up registration. You're driving up turnout locally. It's a local election, so you're not a Democrat or Republican. You're running nonpartisan for selectmen, city council, mayor, school committee, etc. And it helps sell the goals in a bigger way. Next slide. And the expanded voter network would be expanded opportunities for businesses. Hispanic-owned businesses would benefit because we would want to give preference to those businesses that might be into printing, advertising, social media, consulting, in addition to programs that come naturally to Connexion, internship, mentorship programs, increased community involvement, having a large layer of local candidates, and having the necessary resources to do this in a big way. Next slide. Let's go. This is your call to action. Now, I know that this is my final slide. I know that the Hispanic community has different countries of origin. You have Mexicans, Colombians, you have Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Venezuelans, et cetera. But that's not a reason to splinter. To me, that's a reason to unify. And I would treat this goal as sort of like the EU. The EU is the governing body of many different countries, many different cultures. And but they're all part of the EU. They are all together under the banner of the EU. And I think for the Hispanic community, that's the way to think about this. And I hope in a short period of time that we see on the Democratic and Republican tickets an Hispanic political candidate. I think it would do wonders for the community, and it would be great for our country. And I'll any questions that you may have, I'll field at the end of the talk, but I'll turn it over to my co-panelists at this point. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you so much, David. And now we're going to turn over to Phil. He's going to take it the next step a little bit more granular. As we said, David was doing a national perspective, and Phil's going to take us and looking at Massachusetts, which is an exemplar for some of the things that David mentioned. Phil? Great.
Thanks for the opportunity to do this presentation. And I'm going to stay focused on data. Demographer. I think people should vote, and as listening to David is why people don't vote is something even as a kid that I never quite understood. But I want to explain a little bit at the very beginning. This is 2020 presidential election. This is Massachusetts data. Officially, it's called the Current Population Survey. It's a smaller, a little bit larger margin of error. But one of the things you see is by race and ethnicity, there is an eligibility to vote. And so I have two of them up there that you can see. is the do not vote or no vote, not a citizen. And you can see almost a third or 29% of Latino vote can't occur because they are non-citizens. So I'm in the city of Boston. We have a neighborhood, East Boston. East Boston is predominantly Salvadoran and Colombians, and half of the neighborhood is disenfranchised because of that. However, in Massachusetts, Springfield and Holyoke are areas of the state with a high concentration of Puerto Ricans. Puerto Ricans are citizens by birth and have the ability to vote. So there's no, so, you know, now once we get into that, the next thing, David, and you see there is that do not vote by not registering. And you can see that the Latinos compared to the other ethno-racial groups, somewhat in the middle, but much better than Black African Americans. And then we look at actually of all people who don't vote, you know, this is of that total population right here. So remember, I also have in there a little bit different than David's numbers, the people, you know, who couldn't vote because they're non-citizens is a much smaller share, and then 36% of all adult Latinos in Massachusetts vote. But you can see compared to the non-Latino white population in the state, you know, it's dwarfed by that. And, you know, so the Latino population, again, is not that full share of the US population, even in Massachusetts. So the Latino vote is basically there's only one other group that is more harmed by that, is a new arriving immigrant population, the Asian population. So the Asian population in the state is officially in the 2020 to 2010 census was the fastest growing population in the state, due specifically to immigration. Not shown here is the population 0 to 17, children. So another third of the population, or 30% of the Latino population are children, and of course are not eligible to vote. Now, demography is changing. That aging population is somewhat, in Massachusetts and the rest of the country, is mainly a white population who you're seeing, you know, that larger share is partly because they're an older population. I don't have, David would have the data on, you know, the age and voting behavior, but an older population is more likely to vote. And so therefore, David made another very important comment about the Latino population is there is, as a, you know, myself non-Latino, you know, we oftentimes lump this group together. It's a nice Hispanic, Latino, Spanish speaking, but this population is very diverse. So a Cuban population who would be was able to get refugee status after the Cuban Revolution was more likely to get citizenship and pass that citizenship down to their children. That non-citizen population in East Boston that I was talking about are populations that have higher shares of an unauthorized population. So and even something like temporary protective status that allows people to work in the United States through a, you know, which would be considered an authorized population, but still they're trapped into this no way to move forward to citizenship. So the Latino population faces some barriers, you know, so as a result, the organizing, you could see there is efforts to organize. There is a Latino population in Massachusetts that are not registered. And you could even target that population. So for example, if you're looking for resources and trying to get a Latino vote in Massachusetts, I would not do it in East Boston, as I previously mentioned, and you could focus it in parts of the state who are more likely to have being citizens that can vote. And then there's turnout. And so that turnout also is important. And like for any you know, and again, this is a turnout and nonpartisan. It's important that we vote. and getting people to the polls that day. And I always like to tell the story of I worked in an elderly building for the Boston Housing Authority in the 1990s. And when it came time for election day, it was always very, very interesting because the vans started lining up that day, and there were sponsors of each of those vans who were trying to get the population out to vote. And that's an effort, right? And so when you start looking at the Latino population and in Massachusetts, you know, compared to other states, you're going to see states like Pennsylvania, you're going to see Arizona and Nevada. Well, the Latino population and voting eligible population is pretty similar to those states. However, our political organization of state, way we look at states, a vote in Massachusetts oftentimes can be overlooked. To me, that's a big error because it is getting the people out to vote. And as David was saying, getting people out to vote is also getting people to run for office. Excellent point. Because of one of the biggest motivators for voting is by seeing candidates who you would better identify with. So therefore, you know, the vote and to get people out to vote is very, very important. I remember in my own neighborhood one day, I'm a little bit of an oddball. I like to vote at the very end because you slide your thing through the machine and it tells you the number, so I can count how many people vote if I'm at the end of the day. And 10 years ago, there was a very good block captain for someone because she was calling me and at 6 in the evening saying, I haven't voted yet. And that's an effort by a political structure to get people out to vote. So this voting behavior is not an accident. And for what it's worth, when my daughter could sit in the old thing where we pull the curtains behind, I made sure that she got in that voting booth with me. So we can increase the Latino vote and increase by changing our voting behaviors. And you know, I was lucky enough to do this report. As I said, I use existing census data for something called the current population survey, but then there's voting behaviors, and from that I was lucky to work with a colleague at UMass Boston, Luis Jimenez, whose background is voting and helps explain voting behavior there. And so if I could turn it over to Luis, or if you, and you can take it from there.
Thank you, Phil. And Luis, you're up. Oops.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. So I want to talk to you about, I've been tasked to talk about the future of the Latino vote. So one point that David makes about basically we have this potential as Latino voters. This has always been the case, and people have been talking for quite a long time about how to do that. Our report, the one I wrote with Phil, talks a lot about this. And so you can read that to see some of the impediments to this. Part of the reason, the very basic reason, is that it's expensive in terms of the payout because of the eligibility of Latinos. Whenever political parties or other kinds of organizations try to reach out, for every vote they get, they can get 2 or 1.5 or whatever, depending on the particular population. As David was noting, there are places like Holyoke in Massachusetts, but most places in the United States are not like that, except for maybe like Texas or places like that. There's usually a large population of undocumented people or non-citizens who then can't vote. So that's basically one of the big reasons. We talk about other ones, but I do want to mention that. If you can put the slides up. So I want to start with this. So talking about the future of Latino voting, I want to point out a few things. So this is the share of Republican and Democratic votes from Latinos. So as you see, basically the Democrats have always had, well, not always, but at least since 1980, since we've been keeping track of these things, have always had a bigger share of the Latino vote than the Republicans. However, in recent times, in more recent times, Trump, somewhat surprisingly, I suppose, has gained with Latinos, and in some of the polls recently from the New York Times. I don't think you showed this, David, in your poll was a little different, but some of the ones that are at least scaring the Biden campaign is that in some polls, Trump is getting as much as 40%, 41% of the vote. And if that happened, that would be pretty catastrophic, I think, for the Biden campaign. But as you see, George W. Bush was the Republican that got the most votes in recent memory. And so the question is really whether or not this trend that you see here right now, whether that's going to continue, and whether the question is whether this is a blip, and whether people are going to continue moving in the Republican direction. So there's a lot of details about that, but I wanted to start out. This is our baseline. Next slide. So here are the questions going forward. One of the biggest questions in the literature, and I think for pollsters in general, and what makes it, I think, particularly hard sometimes to figure this out is, as far as we can tell, because this is a moving picture, Latinos are sorting themselves along education like the rest of the electorate. So the white electorate and others have been sorting themselves based on education for a while. It used to be roughly from the 1960s on that the Democratic coalition was basically the working class to some extent, and it was multiracial. And Black voters in general have stayed with this sort of coalition more than others. But over time, especially the white electorate has sorted itself out over education. So basically, the more college you have or the more education you have, the more likely you are to support Democrats and vice versa. So Trump in particular has really turned this, has supercharged this, and people that are in have high school education or less are very likely to be Trump voters. Now, there's a lot of discussion on the literature as to why this is, and whether this is something related to rural areas, to whether it's something to media effects or something else. But whatever the reason is, in terms of the overall electorate, it seems that Latinos might be moving in that direction. So there was just an article in the APSR, American Political Science Review, talking about this. And basically, they found that this is the best deep dive on the Trump voting in 2016 and 2020. And basically, they find that lower socioeconomic status among Latinos really made a difference for becoming a Trump voter. Basically, especially in places that you might, or that used to be very blue, like in the Rio Grande in the Valley in Texas, that started to move in the direction of Republicans. So that's one of the big questions. Will they do that? It's hard. It's too early to say. But if I had to guess, I think for lots of reasons, I think Latinos are moving in that direction. And I don't think it's a blip. I don't think it's a Trump related effect. So that's the first question. The second question is, will the Latino electorate continue to grow? If you read our report on 2020 with Phil, and I think even from David's data that he showed, I think the answer to this is a pretty clear yes. I think Latinos, the number of people that will actually vote is going to continue to rise. I don't think there's any question about that. But the real question, I guess the key question is, will they match their eligibility? So from what you saw in David's numbers, I believe it was something like 59% or something like that of the possible voters. So we're not even talking about their overall population, because as we had already mentioned, and this point is important, is that there's a lot of them that are not eligible. But from the eligible population, only about 59% people vote. So the question is, will they match their eligibility? There was a big jump in 2020, but I think that's a blip. I don't think, as far as I can tell, from all the data I've seen, I don't think that that's going to happen this time around. That is, I think it's because eligibility has grown so much. I don't think they're going to keep up with that number. It's a little depressing to me, but it is a little too early to say, of course, because the election hasn't happened. But this is just my general feeling, which I think brings even more urgency to the point that David was making about trying to really move people to vote. So that's the second question. Then the third question, which is something David brought up as well, and also Phil, is, and this is a question that has always been part of the, if you study Latino politics, has always been there. And it has moved the sort of the movement about this question has, the literature has had different answers for this. So which is, will Latinos act more or less as a cohesive group? And to the extent that they don't, why don't they? A big reason why this is, even, I like David's sort of idea about the European Union and how people, sort of come together despite having different languages and all of these different things. The issue, though, unlike with the European Union, is that it's hard to have or part of the reason why the EU works the way it does is because there was a top-down system that is an institutional makeup that can make decisions. And Latinos don't have that. Basically, there is no institutional sort of system that can bring people to vote. So, basically what you would need is some sort of like a machine politics kind of situation, as that's what happened with the Irish, that's what happened with Italians and other groups that were incorporated into the American system. That doesn't happen with Latinos for lots of reasons, historical moments, the kinds of people that are here, etc. But what makes it particularly challenging with them is that there's pressures on both sides of the scale in terms of the kind of people they are, meaning pressures against being cohesive. So you can, what we call Latinos or Latinx or Hispanics or whatever. On the one hand, you have people that have been here for generations. I don't have to explain that to you, of course. People that might not speak Spanish, that might not have anything in common with, Latino, I guess, the label as a group, other than they have some kind of descent from a Latino group, and they might have skin color or something, phenotype that is related to this. And then on the other side are people that are eligible to vote, like Puerto Ricans, but literally stepped off of the plane or the boat or whatever you would say, that have never lived in the United States or the mainland anyway, and might not know much about politics, but they can vote, right? And then there's, of course, other people that might also be eligible to vote relatively soon, who come, but are also very, very recent immigrants. So these are very widely disparate people. And so when you're trying to appeal to them to vote, it's very hard to do because there's very few things that sort of hold this together. We are a very difficult group to kind of pinpoint. And so whenever people try to appeal to us, it's very hard to sort of capture this diversity. The other thing I want to point out is that also the new destinations and the assimilation are also bringing this sort of incohesiveness, if you will. So if you go to the next slide, this is a map of the population of the United States in terms of the percentage of Latinos. So I want to point out a few things. If I showed you this exact map in 1980, you would see most of the people concentrated to the Southwest and New York, roughly speaking. The new areas, if you go to the next slide, actually, it'll show even better, that are happening with lots of Latinos is this map right here. So if you look at the red, what you will see is that this is dramatic growth in terms of, or the places that are seeing more Latino presence. And what I want you to notice on this is that these tend not to be cities. They tend to be rural areas, and they also tend to be conservative states. So they're in the South, or they're in like North Dakota and places like that. Now, these are not dramatic necessarily numbers, but this is where you're seeing growth. And so what happens with these people, generally speaking, as we see with other kinds of groups and with previous waves of immigration, what happens with them is that people, sort of assimilate or become socialized into their neighborhoods or their places they live. And so these folks here, because they're going to places that are more conservative, are more likely to become Republicans. They're more likely to become conservative, which means that right now we have a majority of Democrats, right? This is roughly 60%, and what you might call prefer more leftist policies, roughly speaking. So as more people are becoming assimilated, these new waves are probably more likely to become more conservative, which should be great news for Republicans if they know how to play their cards. And I'll talk about this in just a minute. But this is sort of pressure, right? A pressure in terms of you're going to have this group that has the Latino label, but are going to be very different. Maybe it could be between age, it could be between sort of like newer waves and older waves, and so on and so forth. And also, David kind of mentioned this already, but a huge issue, is country of origin, because the experiences that people bring with them are going to be very different depending on where they come from, and people can't but help bring that along. That is, the way they interpret their new reality is based on what they see back home. And so what David mentioned about the new voters, or the non-voters rather, right? What you see with them, if you looked at Latinos, what you see is similar to what he's talking about, which is that people are very unhappy with the choices. They don't, they like more parties and that sort of thing. So people often don't like that. New Latinos don't, that can vote. And also it's hard for them to understand also why there's parties, but also like things like the Electoral College, or why, that kind of thing. Anyway, so then this leads me to the last question, and I'll leave it at that. The last question about whether this is a Trump effect or not. So if you go back to the first slide, you'll see, right? So this Trump brings us this percentage where people, Republicans are gaining more percentage, and this is actually sort of downplays his effect, because even though the percentage is not, it doesn't seem as high as George W. Bush, these are way more people. The eligible or the people that actually cast a vote, that is Latinos, the actual raw number is way higher, because the percentage is much bigger in 2020 than it was in 2004. And so he is bringing this. There's, for whatever reason, he is having people, more Latinos are voting for him. It seems to be, at least from what the literature says, in part, there's a lot of, the literature talks a lot about this linked fate idea, which is the belief that, which sort of what David was talking about, Phil, too, about this cohesiveness. Basically, if we think of ourselves as being part of a group, that is, we're all Latinos, we're all Spanish speaking, or whatever, however we think of ourselves, we're more likely to vote for Democrats. But if people see themselves not as Latinos, but rather as individuals, or as more related to specific countries, they're less likely to vote. They're more likely to vote for Republicans. And it seems, judging by surveys and other data that I've seen, it seems that the new groups that are coming in are more likely to see themselves that way. They don't see the linked fate part, in part because previous groups, right, from the civil rights movement, which I'm sure Phyllis could tell us a lot about, there was a lot of work on that sort of thing. And so people socialize themselves into seeing themselves as this kind of a group. Now it's a little different. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna leave it at that, and I'll just leave it up for questions. We can talk a lot about this. So, thank you.
Yeah, you each brought a different perspective and different ideas. And coming from Omaha, Nebraska, just to kind of put a point on your comment, Luis, I came from Omaha, and the word "came" is the operative word here. I just felt like I was born in the wrong place, so I left and I came east. So I'm one of those people, but yeah, Nebraska has changed since I left, or I guess it is what it is, but it was always because I left. So there. Carlos, I'll turn it over to you. Carlos Vasquez will now, he's going to open up the floor, and you want to start with our partner.
Thank you, Phyllis. That was awesome, guys. I want to encourage everyone to bring any questions or pointers that you want to share with the discussants. Please raise your hand, or you can put it in the chat, and I'll read it for everyone, however you want to do this.
Start with JD.
Do know that our partner JD Cheslov, who's here today with us, had a question for the discussants, so I'll turn it over to JD in the meanwhile.
Thanks, Carlos, and thanks, Phyllis, for allowing the Roundtable to partner with you on this program. It's I know how passionate you are about this issue. To the speakers, that was just an outstanding bunch of information you shared with us. A lot of thought-provoking data. Really appreciate that. Also, besides organizationally partnering with Conexión, I'm a mentor in Conexión, and I think my mentee Shauna Vera is on. So just a shout out to Shauna. How are you? Sean is awesome, and we've had a great experience so far. So my question, this may be for David, I don't know, but I was in DC a couple of weeks ago. We had a presentation on the national election, and the presenter said there are three things that he's watching for in terms of determining the election. One was, will young voters turn out? One was, will suburbs come out enough for Biden? And the third one was, will Hispanics continue to migrate towards the Republicans, as Luis mentioned? So A, I'm curious about your reaction to that, but B, I was very interested, David, in your slides about if people knew that if their vote could swing an election, they would register and vote. This is a really close election, right? And so I think it would put that to the test. And I'm curious if you think that the three groups outlined by this other presenter will get the message that they could swing this election, and they will get activated and get out and vote.
Yeah, so first off, well, thank you for your sponsorship and your commitment. I know that Connexion is very grateful for that, and I appreciate that. In terms of your question, I think that it's not a question necessarily of will young people vote. Right now, it's who will they vote for? I mean, RFK is getting 14 or 15% of young voters, 14 or 15%. He hasn't spent his campaign, I'm not talking about the Super Bowl PAC ad, his campaign hasn't spent a dime on social media. All they're doing is trying to get on every state ballot so that he's certified, which is going to be a big task, and we won't know until August. I mean, he's on Michigan's ballot, he's on a bunch of ballots, but still has a long way to go. But young people just don't connect with Trump or Biden. And I teach, as much as I can. And to look into the eyes of a Suffolk student or any student who shrugs their shoulders and says, I have no connection with either one of these candidates. They see Biden and Trump as old white guys that are their grandfather or great-grandfather's age, that don't really understand Instagram and TikTok and memes and the kinds of things that they do. And they're hurting. They're hurting. They can't, I was at a wake in my hometown, unfortunately, for a young man who died at age 25 of brain cancer. And I caught up with a lot of family friends at the wake, and obviously a lot of young people who were at the wake. And we're a pretty affluent town, I would say, in Massachusetts. Not one person, and I talked to a lot of kids, I call them kids, they were in their 20s, has bought a house, and they're in their late 20s. And they're still living at home, and they don't want to, but they can't afford a house. They can't even afford to rent. They're trying to rent in their hometown. So that, they're hurting. Young people are hurting. And we know from the data that the most economically sensitive populations are young people and lower income people. And in many cases, these people, even though their parents do well, they're struggling. They're like treading water, trying to pay their bills and be independent. So sure, a lot more young people could vote, but I don't know who they're going to vote for. There's no passion for Biden or for Trump. In terms of the Hispanic part of your question, that's really a different, RFK does well among Hispanics too. But, we know from the data that there's no solid commitment. You saw that slide about what percentage of the people who have a candidate still say they might change their mind and they're not locked in. And that informs us that there's a disconnect, major disconnect. And, in our polling, we didn't have Trump at 41% among Hispanics, but we introduced more options for them. We introduced RFK and all of the other potential third-party candidates as well. And when you do that, a lot of people are either undecided or they'll vote for third party. And when you ask their second choice, if they're RFK or third party, They're voting for someone else who's a third party. They are not voting for Biden or Trump. And that poses a real problem for turnout. I mean, we had an unbelievable turnout in 2020, but you know, you have the same two choices. You have people who are sour on the economy with or Biden, and you know, low enthusiasm if Trump is convicted. Less enthusiasm for that. I did a couple of interviews today. John Keller tonight. You know, you'll see. I did an interview with the LA Times today about this very topic, about how many Trump voters will leave him if he's convicted, if he becomes a convicted felon, and it's about 11%. Those 11% aren't going to immediately vote for Joe Biden. They're going to vote for someone else, RFK or a third-party candidate. And so that's what makes this such a stressful election, is you have all of these variables in play right now. And I'll stop talking there.
We do have two questions in the chat. I know that Luis addressed both of them, but I'd like to put it out there for the other panelists. So we have one question from Dr. Lorna Rivera, and she asks, to what extent are evangelical Latinos making a difference in Republican support? And as a follow-up question to that, Nina Gropera asked, is it only evangelicals? How about Catholics?
Do you want me to just say what I said in the chat?
Yeah,
Or I don't know.
please do.
Okay, I don't know if anybody, David, I don't know if you want to say something about that specifically, but yes, part of it is if actually overall evangelical population was growing rapidly in the 2000s among Latinos, and it has actually sort of ebbed. And I haven't seen the latest data, but I think it has gone down a little bit. But yes, if you are a Latino who's evangelical, the odds of you voting for a Republican go way higher. This one thing really makes a difference. It's not as much as whites. White evangelicals are way higher. I don't remember the exact percentage, but it's really, really high that you're going to be Republican. The difference tends to be on the data I've seen with evangelicals are people that might be maybe more recent or have some kind of connection to other forms of like countervailing assimilation. But in general, that's what makes a difference. Catholics are not, they're more sort of, they act more like the general electorate, like the Latino electorate, I mean, not the overall electorate. I don't know if anybody wants to add to that.
Thank you, Luis. We do have another question by Evelyn Barahona, and she's asking, are there any striking differences in civic engagement and voting between Hispanic-born versus Latino immigrants? And I know you addressed it as well, Luis. I don't know if you want to go ahead and say what you said in the chat.
Yeah, so it really depends on people's individual, like if you're looking at just survey data, there's a lot of literature on this, on specific, that people have looked at individual level and then at the sort of collective level. So individually, what really makes a difference is how engaged you were back home, the reasons why you left, for instance. So if you're an immigrant and you have come because, like, for instance, like, because like you claim asylum, political asylum or something like that, you're way higher more likely to engage and that sort of thing. But if we're looking at groups, so like there's no, everything else is sort of more or less being equal, what makes a difference is basically assimilation. The longer that you've been here, the more likely you are to have been to vote. So, and I mean, it depends on socialization, because like, for instance, Texas, the part around the Rio Grande Valley tends to have very low percentage of assimilation, or I'm sorry, of voting, even though they've been here for, well, since forever. But that has to do with socialization. So it also, right, overall, everything else being equal, the longer you are matters, but it really depends on these other factors.
Thank you, Luis.
I'll jump in with one thing. I think also that, you know, we use this term Latino, and it's very broad. So if you officially go back to it, it goes back to the 1970s when the Census Bureau starts. Prior to that, there's been this, you know, that term. But there are people who identify Latino who identify something called some other Latino. And when I look into that, it's about, in Massachusetts, about 8% of our Latino population. And they're typically US born, and so they don't have quite the identity. So kind of, I think if you have that strong, Puerto Rican identity, so you're Boricua, or however you're going to see, so you're going to see more likely develop. But there's a almost 10% in Massachusetts who really don't have a strong Latino identity. They just claim some of it, right? Think about it. You literally are checking off a box on a form, or when you do that. And and then there's this other segment that are Spanish speaking. They're Spaniards, small, 1 or 2% of the population. So, but you can almost get up to 10%. When we think of Latino, we're thinking Puerto Rican, Dominican, Cuban, Mexican, those type of things. So, just want to kind of broaden that. This is how this variable is being measured, or this, our term we're measuring here, not so much a variable, it's population.
But I want to point out again, I want to just bring this back to the literature finds this exactly what Phil just said about linked fate. So basically, if you put on the box that you're Latino, that's one thing. But if you think of yourself like me and Carlos are the same people, or me and whatever Puerto Ricans and Panamanians or whatever, we're all the same, or we share something, then you're more likely to vote. You're more likely to engage, and you're more likely to vote than others. But if not, then no.
And I don't want to overly complicate this, but then there's Brazilians, right? And how Brazilians identify themselves as well is a whole different story, even though they come from, they're not included in any of these numbers right here. And Brazilian population is a little bit different here in Massachusetts than it is nationally.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you both of you. I have one more question from the chat, and then we'll go to someone in the audience. Janice Jackson asks, what needs to be said or done to engage young Latinos by attending to their concerns? And as a young Latino, I must say, I have a Spanish quote for this: "El que no hace política se la hacen." I don't know what the actual translation would be, but if you don't speak up, somebody's going to speak for you.
Yeah.
But if any of you guys want to address this question.
Yeah, so I'll take a stab at it. I think that there are so many avenues at the local level. National politics is complicated. There are major players, there are major money sources, there are, questions about the authenticity of candidates and whether media outlets are doing due diligence in vetting stories. But I would take it back to the local level. The best way to engage is locally. So if you have a young Latino and they are interested, or you think that getting them interested in politics would be a real win for them because you see something in that person that maybe they don't even see in themselves, have them be involved in a campaign. It could be anything. It could be going door to door. It could be holding a sign. It could be making phone calls. It could be organizing a community festival, or whatever the event. And once they do that, they'll be hooked. They'll love. There's a certain adrenaline rush by participating in the process. And I know that sounds crazy, but the people who are into politics know what I'm talking about. There's an adrenaline rush from that participation, and it's not something that just goes away when it's over. You want your next fix of that rush. You want to be involved in a bigger campaign or a better cause, and so on. And then that person's off to the races. They may not want to be a candidate. They may want to just fundraise, or they may want to design ads or do social media outreach or opposition research or polling or whatever it might be. But getting involved will serve the community well, but also give that individual an amazing amount of confidence and a healthy connection to the process.
I really like David's point about local politics. I want to echo that. I think that I work obviously with young people because I teach them. I work with them and I send them out to the to work in the state and the city. And I see a lot of that. I think that the main problem in general for young people is that often they don't know where to start. And so I think David's point is very well taken, that often we just people just don't know, and then sort of you just need sometimes they don't know that they would be great at something, and so you kind of send them along, and that works. But anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Luis. We have one question from Ken in the audience. Ken?
Hi, hello everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. I'm coming from East Los Angeles, and I'm not sure if this is the place for it, but I just wanted to, and it segues from what you're just talking about, local politics. I come from an area that's 100% Latino, Chicano, and every one of my representatives is of Hispanic Latino origin. And one of the things that and we are a very low turnout rates in our area, historically very, very low. Los Angeles in general, but particularly East LA, Boyle Heights, where I'm starting to organize around voting. And this past voting opportunity at the primaries, I went to my local voting place, polling center, and it was closed down. And it was at the Salazar Park, which is where the Chicano moratorium and the riots were, a historical place. So I live right in between unincorporated Los Angeles and city of Los Angeles, divided by one main street. So I had to go looking for my polling place, which was 3 miles away. And I had a car, I had transportation. It was in a small park, and it was very difficult to get to. It was on a night when they had basketball going on, taekwondo, baseball, soccer. So there's no parking. So unincorporated East LA has 200,000 people in it, and the main polling place in our area was shut down. And I wanted to know, my question is, if our politicians, our representatives who are Latino, fail to operate a polling center where people can walk to, I know it helped determine the vote in our area, which is low. What can we do if we can't, even if we have areas that are highly populated with Latinos, and yet we can't service Latinos and allow them to vote? I have 5 months until November, and I want to get that polling center back open. And this is even before about going out and making sure that young voters vote. The people who want to vote didn't have access to a polling center. So I think this might happen in other areas where there's high Latinos who are out there, high rates of Latinos in communities in Chicago or up north, Northern California, where Florida. So if we can't get our own politicians who represent us, who are Latino, to kind of offer resources to make sure that we vote, I'm sure it's even harder in other areas, rural areas across the country, where they don't have access to vote. So thank you for having this forum. And the reason why I came on is because I want to start looking at solutions and look at who to go to turn to make sure that, the opportunities of vote and access are there for the community. So I'm not sure if you can answer that or point me in a direction, but it's just very frustrating that even in high concentrated areas, we don't have access or resources to secure our votes.
Well, Ken, it sounds like some other voters, maybe not you, but some other voters were disenfranchised. And, this happens in a lot of different areas around the country, and it's a big problem. Because there's no universal control. And it also sounds to me like this story that you've just shared with us would be a wonderful campaign commercial for you if you ever decided to run for office locally. Because if I was managing your campaign, that would be the campaign video that I would use to kick off your campaign on social media, what you just said, and how important it is to empower people so that, people who don't have cars, people who don't have the patience to drive around and find a parking spot, and who want to participate in the process. So, this may be an opportunity for you. But in terms of the next 5 months, I think my suggestion to you would be notify the people who were responsible for this, but also urge them to participate in an active, aggressive early voting campaign, so that other people who may not have your patience and your resources will be able to have their vote counted because they can drop it off at a Dropbox or they can vote early by mail. And I think that, that in, at least not in California, my son's a USC student, so I'm well aware of what's going on in LA, but in some of the other states, in the swing states, that early voting could make a big difference.
Great suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, Kay, I would also, I think those are great suggestions, social media, but I also would go with regular media if you have access to the TV news or whatever. But the main people obviously has to be the California Board of Elections. I don't know who specifically within the LA system. Those are the people that have to be responsive to this. And anything you can get where you have people, I don't know, demanding that this happens, especially if you can get some large group of people, whether in with the help of media in any way, I think that's the only way to do it. But in terms of the larger conversation for everybody else, I think in general, this debate about how easy or not easy it is to vote, we didn't even get into this, but part of the reason why Latinos in general, and a lot of people don't vote in the US, is because we do make it very, very difficult to vote. I think if we had a system like Oregon does, and like we did in 2020, where people could just mail in their vote, I think that would make a huge difference. In part, the reason why I'm a little sort of depressed, or not depressed, but I think I'm bearish on the Latino vote going up, is because I think part of the reason why the 2020 vote went up last time so much is because we made it easy. Not just here in Massachusetts, but in a lot of places, people could vote. There were more early days, all kinds of things where people just made it easier to vote, and that made a huge difference. That's not going to happen in 2024. And in fact, Republicans are very much against this now. It has become somewhat of a partisan thing because they think that Trump lost because of this. So it's, I think, an uphill battle, but I think we do have to regain some kind of debate nationally, not just at the local level, about we should make this easier to vote. It should not be hard to vote in this country. And whether that means, changing to a Sunday or whatever, or early voting, I'm okay with any of that, but we really need to work on that. And I think Democrats are making a big mistake in general, other organizations, and not trying to make this just easy to vote. Forget everything else. Let's just make easier to vote.
I think that also replies to one of the questions we had on the chat. Someone was interested in hearing about the challenges to getting to the polls, access, work hours, and childcare. And I think you've done a great job on responding to that. Would anybody else like to ask another question, comments, suggestions? All right, looks like that's that. Phyllis,
Hey,
over to you to
well,
wrap.
my hope is that this evening did push your thinking. I think it kind of did. It's the sense I got. This is something, as was mentioned, that we are passionate about. We think it's critically important. And as all the speakers indicated, that Latinos are in a position to make a real difference. Each one of us, each one of the people on this call and your friends, each one of us has a network that we can tap into. And the suggestions that all of them made, and I would also encourage you to look at the Gascon report on the forward and on page 9, I believe. On those two sections, there are ideas about ways to get people involved, and also on David's slides, and David indicated that he would be happy to share his slides. So we will make all of that available to you. I want to thank you again for participating, for joining us, and stay tuned. We'll have more of these kinds of conversations in the months to come. And if we can be of help to anybody, Ken, we do have people in California. Greg Flores is on the call. He's mentoring somebody. I think she's in Los Angeles, I believe. Greg's mentee is. So we're in LA. So we'd be happy to help. And again, thank you, everyone. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to all of you that attended. And have a great rest of your week. And see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a blessed night.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody.
So